portraits from the Old Testament. Last year we did a series on portraits from the Old Testament, so we can call that season 1 and tonight is season 2. Let's take a moment to look at the overall flow of the story in the Bible, just to get our bearings. Okay? This is an outline which will be available each week for the next few weeks. Many of you will know most of the story. We've got Adam and Eve, starting with creation there, the various people in the early book of the Bible, Genesis, Cain and Abel, the flood, Noah, Tower of Babel, and then you come through to people later in Genesis, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph, and then you've got the Exodus from Egypt, and the story of Israel with its kings and its judges and its prophets for many hundreds of years. And tragically, we get to this point where there is exile because Israel has disobeyed God, and God eventually allows them to be taken into captivity. But in his love, he brings them back into Israel, and then eventually we come through to the New Testament and the story of Jesus and the early church. So there's all of these events that are happening over many hundreds of years, and there are lots of stories that we can learn from in the Bible. And today we're looking in this column here, and we're looking at the name Jacob. And next week we'll be looking at Joseph, and then we'll be going on from there. So we have that background. And I want to do a quick survey of Jacob's story and then simply talk about a couple of themes that stood out for me. So, this is what we have in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. We have our origin stories in the first few chapters, and then we have 4 main names, which are 4 generations of God's people. Abraham, then Isaac is the son of Abraham, and he had a brother named Ishmael. Then we have Jacob and his brother Esau, and then we have Joseph and his brothers. So those are the 4 main generations that are talked about in the main book of Genesis there. And then if we look specifically at Jacob, this is how the story flows to me, anyway. We have here Jacob being born in chapter 25. And you will notice with the colours, I'm hoping the colours help you to see that there's a pattern, a kind of a pattern of exile and return. And so you get events that are happening at the beginning and end which create a bracket of Jacob's story. So we get a dream of stairway to heaven there, and that comes after Jacob and Esau and their conflict and exile. And we're going to talk further about that. And then at the end, we're going to get Jacob and Esau returning in their reconciliation with a special vision again that happens before that. And in the middle, we get an important story of the conflict. First of all, the friendship, but then the conflict between Jacob and Laban. Laban is Jacob's uncle, and we're going to look at that in more detail. And they become friends to start with. They become enemies at the end because of the battle between them. But in the middle, Rachel and Leah and the 12 children, which is a central part of the story because that becomes the origin story for Israel as a whole, with the 12 tribes of Israel based on the names of Jacob's 12 children. And then we get at the end, I put this in for completeness, the last 13 chapters of Genesis is mainly focused on Joseph and his brothers, but it is still part of the story of Jacob because chapter 50, the last chapter of Genesis, Jacob is still alive, and Jacob and his family end up going down into Egypt. And that's the start of another important exile and return which God will miraculously bring about in the book of Exodus. So there's all these things going on, and there's a lot of themes. We read stories, but we've got to remember that they're not just stories. They're stories with a purpose. And so as we study the stories, we can learn a lot about what God does in the lives of real people. So let's have a look now at Genesis chapter 25. We're going to read just 5 or 10 verses. They'll be up on the screen, but you're welcome to have a look at the book. As long as you give me a page. Genesis is the first book, so we're early on. Chapter 25. We have a page number, please. 21. Page 21 in your Bible. Genesis 25, and I'm starting at verse 19. The story goes like this. This is the account of the family of Isaac, the son of Abraham. When Isaac was 40 years old, he married Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean, from Paddan Aram, and the sister of Laban, the Aramean. Isaac pleaded with the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was unable to have children. The Lord answered Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah became pregnant with twins. But the 2 children struggled with each other in her womb, so she went to ask the Lord about it. "Why is this happening to me?" she asked. And the Lord told her, "The sons in your womb will become 2 nations. From the very beginning, the 2 nations will be rivals. One nation will be stronger than the other, and your older son will serve your younger son." And when the time came to give birth, Rebekah discovered that she did indeed have twins. The first one was very red at birth and covered with thick hair like a fur coat. So they named him Esau. Then the other twin was born with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So they named him Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when the twins were born. As the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman, but Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game Esau brought home, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Just 10 or so verses, but they're an important introduction to the story of Jacob. They're just like the opening notes of a great piece of music, where those first few notes define all the themes for the whole piece of music, the whole symphony that is to come. And so these verses introduce us to the characters and themes that are going to play out in the rest of Jacob's life. And I want to highlight just 2 of those themes that stood out to me. The first one is this: Jacob is ordinary. Jacob is ordinary. He's a real person with all his mixed up faith and brokenness. We see him, for instance, born into an ordinary, real family. The story places him in a particular line of descent. We know who his ancestors are. And later on, we're going to meet his children and their ancestors going forward. His mother, Rebekah, who was barren. In other words, from the story perspective, not perfect, because in that culture, having children was a sign of God's blessing. So if you were barren, that was bad news in the story. Jacob's father is Isaac, and Jacob's grandfather is Abraham, and that points back to the covenant with God. Notice also in these opening verses that Laban is mentioned. Jacob has an uncle, Rebekah's brother Laban, and he will be an important character later in the story. So those are the people. That's the list of actors in the play, if you like. But note also the relationships and the dynamics that are going on between these people. Rebekah gives birth to twins. And even before the birth, she's been given a prophecy that there will be great conflict between the 2. And now at the time of birth, Esau is delivered first, and then Jacob, who is born grasping on to his older brother's heel, which is why he's named Jacob. The Hebrew word for Jacob's name means to grasp, to take hold of. That's the literal meaning of it. But in a symbolic sense, it was often used for the ideas of grasping something that you shouldn't have. So the idea of taking hold by force, or being tricky and deceiving people and getting something that's unfair. Mm-hmm. And as we read Jacob's story, we're going to see this theme of deception and trickery played out time and time again. The first verse of that trickery theme is Esau himself, the older brother, and as such he's entitled to the birthright and blessing of his father. But Jacob tricks his brother out of that birthright, and Esau is so angry that Jacob is forced to run away to another country, and he ends up living with his uncle and cousins for many years. And then the story devotes 3 whole chapters to that relationship between Jacob and Laban, and we can probably sum up those 3 chapters in one sentence, being Jacob versus Laban. Who is the most cunning? And Jacob falls in love with Laban's younger daughter Rachel and wants to marry Rachel. But guess what? Laban tricks Jacob into marrying the older sister Leah, who doesn't look so pretty and therefore is not so attracted by the guys. But apparently because she's the older daughter, she needs to get married first. That was the culture in those days. So Jacob ends up marrying both of the daughters. Utter chaos. And Laban also tries to trick Jacob out of all the wages, the flocks and the herds that he's entitled to during his time working for Laban. But this time, Jacob proves to be the more cunning one. And the story, if you read right through, shows how Jacob manages to trick Laban out of all the best sheep and herds and goats. And because of that, they become enemies, and again Jacob's got to flee for his life. And I tell you what, if all of this sounds weird, it's because it is weird. That's the way the story rolls. There's another verse from our reading that's worth repeating. As the boys grew up, Esau became a skillful hunter. He was an outdoorsman, but Jacob had a quiet temperament, preferring to stay at home. Isaac loved Esau because he enjoyed eating the wild game Esau brought home, but Rebekah loved Jacob. You see, it's not just Jacob who is broken in this story. There are 4 people all in this one family, all completely different, and all of them less than perfect. Sound familiar? When I read this story, I'm almost tempted to use the modern word dysfunctional. But then I start to see, for instance, parallels with my own family. And think about how my wife and I love each other dearly. But the challenge is simply because we are very different people. And as for our 2 sons, don't even get me started on that. And it's so easy with all those differences to begin to relate to one person in your family differently from the other, and think it's easier to get on with one of my sons and not the other one, and you just let that pattern happen. And lo and behold, you've got all these breaks and divisions in your family relationship. If Jacob's family is dysfunctional, it's because every family is dysfunctional to one extent or another. Yours and mine, all of us. Now, you may be sitting there thinking, why is Peter going on about all of this stuff? And it's because I have had so many conversations with people over the years, trying to read stories in the Bible in a way that makes the characters in the Bible special. And so, for instance, we know that Abraham is a man of great faith, don't we? We read verses like, Abraham believed God, and God credited it to him as righteousness. And we think, well, this is a man of great faith. I couldn't possibly live up to that standard. But we forget that in other chapters of the Bible, Abraham showed very lacking faith by trying to do stuff in his family life according to his own personal plans, and you see how that got stuffed up. Well, think about David. How often have you heard people talk about David being a man after God's own heart? And we take that verse out of context and we think to ourselves, this is a man who is incredibly 100% passionate and committed to God. That's why God chose him. But it's actually the other way around if you read those verses in the right way. After God's own heart means after God's own purposes. In other words, it's not David who is choosing God. It's God who is choosing David. And this David, who certainly is passionate in worship with God, is also the person, the same king who committed murder and adultery to get the woman Bathsheba that he'd fallen for. So what we've got to understand is that these people in the Bible are ordinary, real, warts and all, human beings. And their stories are like that. It's precisely why this is such great comfort. If a person like Jacob is able to make connections and build a relationship with God, that's good news for us. And so we've got to remember the reality and the ordinariness of all the heroes of the Bible that we read about. So that's the first thing. The second thing is God is still faithful. Jacob is ordinary, but God is still faithful. And God's faithfulness is a regular part of the story of Jacob. In the very first verse of our reading, we're reminded that Jacob's grandfather is Abraham. So immediately we're pointed back to God's covenant promises to Abraham. That refers back to chapter 12, where the Lord said to Abraham, leave your native country, your relatives and your father's family, and go to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you and make you famous, and you will be a blessing to others. I will bless those who bless you and curse those who treat you with contempt. All the families on earth will be blessed through you. And Rebecca's barrenness, that's another connection back to this same story, because Abraham's wife, Sarah, was also barren. And so we have another thread that is running through the whole of the Genesis story of people who are in a situation where they are unable to bring about life by themselves. If it depended on Abraham and Sarah alone, that would have been the end of the story. If it depended on Isaac and Rebecca alone, that would have been the end of the story. But it's not, because the theme here is that God is the ultimate source of life. And in each of these human stories that we're reading about, there is a God who is bringing about his good and perfect plans. God, the long story we might call it, God has made a promise to bless his chosen people. And we will see this promise made true generation after generation after generation. And the Jewish people throughout the centuries understood this well, and it became an important part of their worship. So just for a moment, have a look at this, just one of the Psalms that we could have chosen, Psalm 105. The psalmist writes, remember the wonders he, that's God, has performed, his miracles and the rulings he has given, you children of his servant Abraham, you descendants of Jacob, his chosen ones. So this psalm is written hundreds of years later, and they are still looking back to the story, which is not just a story, but a story with purpose. And the purpose is that God is doing great things in his chosen people, generation by generation. Verse 8, he always stands by his covenant, the commitment he made to 1,000 generations. This is the covenant he made with Abraham and the oath he swore to Isaac, And he confirmed it to Jacob as a decree and to the people of Israel, time after time after time, as a never-ending covenant. The other way that we see God's faithfulness in Jacob's story is in specific and special occasions where Jacob is in desperate need of God's help. He appears to Jacob twice. The first one is where he's fleeing for his life from Esau, who has threatened to kill him. And if you read the whole story, you see that he has a dream in which there is a staircase that comes down from heaven, and there are angels going up and down the staircase. And he wakes up in the morning and thinks, what's that all about? And he realizes that it's a sign that God has been with him, and God is with him. And he says, surely God was in this place. And it becomes a great encouragement to him in a time of crisis in his life. God had not abandoned him. And as we saw in our overview, the second story is just before he's returned to meet Esau after many years away. And he's still at this point terrified of what Esau might do. So he sends all his flocks and his household off ahead of him as effectively as bribes. In other words, the crafty, manipulating Jacob is still, there's a little bit of him there, and he's sending all these gifts off to try and placate his brother. So he's doing whatever he can, but then the story says, at last Jacob was left all alone. And a man wrestled with him all night. And it's a story that has a strong sense of mystery about it. Different people read it in different ways. Is it real? Is it a dream? Is it a vision? Ultimately, that part doesn't matter. What does matter is the theme is clear. It's about Jacob wrestling with God and refusing to give in until God has blessed him. And the story finishes with God saying, your name will no longer be Jacob. From now on, you will be called Israel, which means God fights. And it's about the story of how God, it's not just Jacob fighting with God, it's God fighting with Jacob, fighting to bring about transformation in his life. The ordinary flesh and blood man who once upon a time tried to get his own way through his natural sneakiness, that man, because of God at work in his life, is learning how to trust God. Not perfectly, but there is a true level of transformation in Jacob's life at this point. I love the fact that the Bible is not just rules and theology and principles, as if we're doing a research paper at Bible college. A lot of the Bible is just made up of simple stories. Stories are good. Stories are something I can get a grip on. I love a good story. And so we see that the Bible and people in the Bible that we read about are not special, they're ordinary, and in the same way, their stories are ordinary, just like ours. And from what I've known, being here and in other churches throughout the years, you and I also have stories which show how God can be faithful in the lives of ordinary people. I could tell you the story of my conversion, how from a place of complete atheism, God opened my eyes. He was faithful literally to draw me to himself in the first place. I could tell you stories about my call to ministry, which was quite a challenging and difficult journey over 2 or 3 years. But God, throughout that journey, first of all made it clear to me that that was what he wanted me to do. And secondly, provided incredible support, people who loved Phil and me over a 2 or 3 year period, people who paid more than $10,000 of financial support to make sure that we were able to actually go down to Dunedin to Knox College to do the training that I needed to do there. I can think of God's faithfulness in difficult ministry settings. I can think of times when I have been spiritually abused, but always there have been special ways that God has touched people to provide prayer and support for me, to walk with me in those difficult times. Words of prophecy that have touched me deeply. All of those things are really important. I think one of the things that God has shown his faithfulness to me personally in this church is simply the fact that it exists. And it exists in a way that, for me, the key word that I use to describe this church is sanctuary. It's a place where I know that when I am here, I am safe, no matter what. And I can encounter God's love through the people of God loving me. And I'm sure many of you have stories. They'll all be personal to you, but they will all be real because ordinary people connecting with an extraordinary God is what the Bible is all about, and it's what our lives are all about. It's what our testimony to God's faithfulness is all about. Let's have a discussion question. How has God been faithful in your life or in the life of church at 126? I'm conscious that tonight's the first week of our series, and I kind of feel like what we're talking about tonight is true about Jacob, but it will also be true for the next 6 weeks. We're going to hear stories of many people in the Bible. And so maybe this is a question which we should hold in our hearts, not just for tonight, but for the next 5 or 6 weeks as we listen to the stories that other people will bring forward week by week. So take 10 minutes or so and we will wrap up. Okay, so there's your discussion question. Over to you.